Making figures in newer versions of Excel is pretty straightforward, and it seems as though the newer versions of Excel, as well as spreadsheet software like Google Sheets, are using very similar formulas and formatting. So doing this on Excel here, it looks pretty similar to what you have to do on something like Google Sheets, so that's a good thing. Although the formatting has changed and the layout of Excel has changed a bit over the years in terms of formatting and things like that, the same ideas apply when making a chart. And as soon as we get a chart up here, the way to format the chart and make it look how you want and change titles and things like that really is pretty consistent from version to version to version. Slight differences here and there, but you can probably figure it out if you're using a different version of Excel or a different spreadsheet program altogether. Now the first thing we're going to do if we want to actually plot some data is get some data. So what I've done here is I brought in some data from real data from a mission to Mars called MAVEN. I'm a space physicist. I do research on Mars, and so this data is readily available to the public. I'll put this on the canvas so that people can work with this data alongside. If you want to take a break and go grab this file, this is the name of the file. It's going to be in the file section on Canvas. All right, so I've brought this file in. This file is actually called a comma separated value file. You'll see the extension is CSV, although you can't see that up here. .csv files are readable by Excel. It basically just brings the data in and formats it like this, so you don't really have to do anything other than open up the file. Now what we see here is there's a whole bunch of data here, and we're not going to work with all of this data, but I kind of want to give you an idea of what real data looks like from a real NASA mission. And so what you see here is there's a variety of different columns filled with data. We've got time information. This is also time information. This is some more time information, and also this is time information. This is also some more time information. So we've got plenty of time information about our data points. We're only going to really worry about one column here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's some orbit information. This just tells us the orbit number. This data is organized by orbit, so this file pertains to this orbit of the spacecraft as it's gone around Mars many times. This is some specific operational mode of the instrument, nothing to worry about. This is really the stuff that we're probably primarily interested in. All right, so this column here, H column, is altitude. This is local solar time, or basically like local time in a sense. This is longitude, latitude, solar zenith angle. This is the angle the sun makes with the spacecraft makes, the angle of the spacecraft, Mars, and the sun, basically. Not really anything we need to worry about here because you see it doesn't change very much. This is the information about the species that we're looking at. These measurements are and this is the abundance of this species. So the real data here is the density of this species argon. That's the data. All this other stuff is basically like telemetry, information that we need to understand this data, but this is the column that has the data in it that we actually want. Right? This last column is precision. It's basically telling us how good the data is. Anything below 1 is probably pretty good data. You see a blip here where there's a high precision value, which is actually bad data. But we're not going to worry too much about that here because we're not doing anything too crazy with the data. All right, we can see if we scroll down, there's actually quite a bit of it. If you were to go and find this data on the web, which you can do from by going to NASA's Planetary Data System, this is actually only part of the data file. There's actually several other species that we can look at. Not important though. What we're going to do is just take a look at this argon data and just do some plots. Right, so the first thing I want to do is just to show you how this works, I'm going to plot a couple different things. This time, UTC, this is the actual time of the instrument. I'm going to expand out this row or this column so that you can see it. This is the time that the instrument takes a data point. And what you see, this is formatted so that I can read it as a human. The computer has a real hard time reading this because this isn't really sequential. 2015, 10, 31, there's dashes. Eventually, this could roll over into a new date, although it doesn't because this is all taken on this particular date. But think about how a computer would try to read this. I mean, the data doesn't go sequentially. There's weird characters. The computer doesn't know how to format this. It doesn't understand that this is a time. So we're going to use this row right here as basically a placeholder for time. And the reason is because this is sequential. You can see that the rightmost number, it's a long number, but the rightmost number is increasing throughout this entire data set. And the computer can look at this and say, okay, I understand, I can plot that. So we're going to use this as the time. Now this is actually a time, but I don't want to get into the details. It's basically the number of seconds from some fixed date in the past. That's all it is. So it is a time, and we could actually convert this to this date, but for the computer, this is going to work much better. So what I want to do is just plot something of interest. Let's go over here and let's plot the longitude of the spacecraft as a function of time, because that's probably something we can interpret pretty easily. Whenever I want to make a plot, the first thing I need to do is select the data that I want to plot. Now you guys know how to select data, click and drag like so. I can use the shift key to click and drag on another column. I can use the command key, click and drag like this, and I can use the command key to select some other data corresponding to my time. Now, that allows me to select a subset of data, but I want to plot all the data. So what I'm going to do instead of just selecting a subset is I'm going to click on column B, hold the command key or the control key on a Windows machine, and click the column J. All right, that way I do a multiple selection of 2 columns of data. We can't really plot anything if we're just, we can't plot anything meaningful if we only select 1 column of data. All right, so we always generally want to select 2 data columns. Once I have that, I'm going to go up here to Insert, and I'm going to make a chart. And so over here in the middle, I've got some chart options. You can see that Excel is going to try to recommend a chart. Let's just not even, we know what we want. Let's do it ourselves. So over here, you can see these are XY scatters. 99% of the time when we're doing physics, we probably want a scatter plot. And so this is usually the button you want to hit. And if you click on that, you see you get some other options. Let's just go with a scatter right here, because that'll make life really easy. There are some other options that might be useful, like we could do lines and things like that, but we're going to go ahead and just do a straight up scatter plot. And you can see the reason why. The scatter plot fills in our data, and there's so much data it actually looks like it's connected by a line. Now, this first plot that shows up, Excel is guessing on what we want here. So you can see that Excel is plotted on the y-axis, it's actually plotted the longitude, and on the x-axis it's plotted the time. That's what we want, longitude versus time, that's fine. But it's kind of given me the bare bones here. There's no axes on the y-axis, there's no title on the x-axis. There's these grid lines which you may or may not want. This says long because that's what it's trying to plot. It's trying to figure out what to plot. But we definitely could make this plot look better. The first thing that I notice is like this is tiny and I can't really work with it. So I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Now, when you're working with your data, maybe starting out, I think this is totally fine to make this chart kind of on top of your data sheet here. But if you're giving this data to somebody else, or you're giving this plot to somebody else, I think it's kind of ugly to have it sitting on top of the data. And it's much nicer if you were to have this as part of its own worksheet. So what I like to do usually, when I'm done with the chart, is move it. So if I right click on the chart itself, you can see I get a bunch of options here. One of the options is move chart. If I go ahead and click that, I can either put it as an object in this worksheet, or I can create a new sheet called whatever I want. I'll just leave it as chart 2, and it'll create a new worksheet. And now my chart looks a little bit nicer. It's bigger. It's got its own place. It's not covering up a bunch of data. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. I just think that this looks a bit nicer. Now, when I click on the chart, or I'm working on the chart, you see I get some options up here. There's a lot of different things I can do. For example, sometimes you might want to switch the rows and columns because Excel didn't get it right the first time. The problem is here that we got a little bit of an issue because of the data that we're using, but usually you can hit this button, it'll quickly switch those around for you. More often what you have to do is hit the select data button, and you can see the select data button says, okay, well maybe we got the wrong data, maybe we didn't get we want to change the data that we're actually plotting. And you can see here that I can go ahead and I can select out my x values and my y values separately. So if I somehow want to change the data that I'm charting, I can do that very easily. Come over here and I can highlight this, and then I can go to my spreadsheet and I can select the data that I want. And so again, I just want this column. I kind of messed that up. I want this column, so I'll tell Excel that I want that. This button will hide this thing for a second so that I can actually go work with my spreadsheet. Stop doubling up the data, and so I can put in the data that I want. Now you can look at this this descriptor and it looks like a mess. That's because the name of my worksheet is this long, ugly name. That's just what it was given on when I opened up the file. So you could certainly make this easier to work with by changing the name of this particular sheet. But again, it doesn't really matter because you're probably not going to type this in. And then here we have just the Excel syntax for give me the entire J column, $J, $J. So that's what that means. You can see that my X values, again, working with the ugly spreadsheet name. I'm sorry, my Y values. Oh, I made a mistake. This should have been, sorry, let me change that really quick. This should not be the J values. Those are my X values, which we wanted a time. So I'll change that really quickly. And my Y values are, in fact, now you can see the J column. All right, so I'm plotting longitude as a function of time. Here is an option I can add more data. So if I wanted to overplot some other data, I could do that by just clicking the plus sign. And now it's asking me, okay, well, what do you want to overplot? I'll give it the X values by clicking on that button and selecting column B. Click down, and then now I need to select the Y values. So let's do latitude and see how this looks. I'm not really sure. It's going to be a little bit wonky, but we'll do it anyway. All right, there's my two values, and if I hit OK, you can see now I get a plot that shows two things. Okay, you can see when I did that, it changed the x-axis a little bit. This is not what we want. These horizontal axis values are simply just the data point number. So we've got about 375 data points, and so it's just plotting here the longitude versus 0, the longitude versus 1, 2, the data point number, instead of the actual time. And that's not what we want. All right, so I'm just going to take us back to where we were originally. So here's my longitude versus time plot again. Now, of course, like I said, this is formatted dumbly. Excel doesn't know what the units are, doesn't know anything about the title, so I want to add that stuff. Let's start making this plot look professional. Now, there's a couple ways to do things when we're working with charts. You see how these options here, and I can do some quick layouts and do different design things. This is all just changing the look of the plot, changing colors and things like that. I don't really want to mess with any of that stuff because Excel doesn't do things very well. If I click on Format, you can see I also have some other things to again, get into the formatting a little bit. But really what I want to do is there's a lot more options here. And so if I go over to the chart area and right-click, you can see that I get a bunch of different options. So, save as template. If I like the way that this chart looks, I can select the data, which I've already done, move the chart, I can group, etc. At the bottom here, I can format the chart area, which again allows me to change things like the fill, the color, all that stuff that is important but not critical to the plot looking good. All right, but what I want to do is I want to change the titles. So to do that, instead of when I mouse over, you see how it says chart area. If I mouse over the axis, you can see that now that it says vertical axis. And so if I right click right now, you'll see that I'm going to get some different options for my formatting. So I can add grid lines, I can format the grid lines, and I can format the axis. So let's go over here and format the axis. You can see that I get a bunch of different options again, and I can do things like change the bounds. So let's say if I didn't want this to go all the way down to 0, I wanted it instead to maybe start at, looks like at a value of 10, I could do that. And so now I'm kind of zooming in on my plot a little bit. I could change the units of the major marks, the major and minor tick marks. So you can see here the major tick marks go every 5. If I had minors, I could go every 1. I could make this different by changing the major to 10 if I wanted to. Not that any of this matters. I kind of liked how it looked with more major tick marks, so I'm going to leave that. You can see that there's a variety of different options for the horizontal axis. And then at the bottom here, we've got tick marks. We can change what the tick marks actually look like. So if I click on oh, it's not going to let me do this, but I can change how those look like. Generally, this stuff we can just leave alone. Oh, and then there's one other option that we may find useful, not right now, but maybe in the future. You notice that I can make the y-axis, I can put that on a logarithmic scale. And so if I click that button, it doesn't do us much good because our data doesn't span very many orders of magnitude. But if my data goes across many orders of magnitude, so let's say this point was like 10 and then this point was at 1 million, I might want to show that on a logarithmic scale. We'll do that a little bit later. Okay, so that's how I can format the axis. And again, all the options that you could possibly want, you can click through here and you can play around with these different things. But usually the base formatting is probably what you want. For professional looking figures and graphics, we don't want anything too complex. What I do want is I would like to get some titles on my axes. So the way to do that is go over here to this Add Chart Element box, and this allows me to add different things to my chart. So you can see I can add axes, additional axes. I can add titles, chart titles, add some labels, all sorts of different things. So right now I just want to add some axis titles. And so let's start with the vertical. And you see I get this little box here. It's waiting for me to double click to add some text. And this is going to be just longitude. All right, a little bit tough to see. I think that's kind of a little bit small, so maybe we can make this, if we can make it a little bit bigger, that'd be great. So if I right-click on the title, you can see here I get the font option, or Command T, I can get the font option. And what that'll allow me to do is increase the font size to what I think looks nice. So maybe 14-point font, that'll work. All right, so I've got myself a nice vertical axis. Well, let's add next we're going to add a horizontal axis. So let's go to a primary horizontal title. Again, we get the axis title. This is going to be time. We're going to remind ourselves that it's Unix time, some time that we don't exactly know what it means because I don't want to get into it. Again, I'm going to right-click on the font and the text, choose font, and then I'm going to increase this to 14-point font just so we can see it. All right, so now we're starting to get something that looks reasonable. I don't like this title up here, long, it's kind of meaningless. So I'm going to double click on long to make this longitude versus time. That's really what the title of the plot is. Okay, there we go. We've got a pretty decent looking plot at this stage. You can't tell because there's so many data points, but these are individual data points themselves. It's not a single line. It's really hard for me to zoom in and show you that, but these are actually are actual data points. I don't mind how these look. You can change them. You can add a line if you want. You know that we can also change the markers. We can make them different colors. This sort of thing. We can make them smaller. In this case, that's the line that's we're making smaller. But you can change you could change how all of these look using these options. But for now, I mean the default is pretty good. Just pick a color. It doesn't really matter. What I care about and what you should care about as a scientist is making sure that these things, that everything makes sense. You should have units where units are appropriate. You definitely need to have titles. Grid lines are okay to have. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. It just depends on what they look like. But this is the basic idea of what your plot should look like. So let's go ahead and play around with the data a little bit and make one or two more charts. All right. Let's get rid of this guy. All right, so here we're back at our data table, and I want to make another chart of the actual data that we're interested in. We were playing around with the longitude, but let's take a look at the density data. So that's this abundance column. We want to plot that again. This time, let's not plot against time. Let's plot abundance as a function of altitude. This is going to give us an altitude profile of the argon density around Mars and sometime in 2015. Oh, Halloween 2015. Didn't even notice that. All right, so I select my data. And again, I go back to, insert, and pick a chart. Again, we're going to do a scatter. All right, you see I get a scatter chart right off the bat. It's tiny. I'm going to move that over to chart 4, I guess. And I'm going to move it to chart 4. Okay, so when I do that, I get this nice this chart right here. Now, there's an issue with this chart. It's not really obvious at first, but if we take a close look at these axes, you might see it. I think it makes more sense to plot density on the x-axis and altitude on the y-axis because we associate altitude with the up and down direction. But this data right here is actually the density data. You can tell because the numbers are so large. This data is the altitude data. You can see it goes 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers. So I'd like to switch this. Now, if I hit the switch row and column, that won't work with Excel because it hangs up because of some maximum number of data. So, okay, that's fine. So what we can do is try to do this manually by selecting the data. If I do that and just select out manually, let's start with the y values. All right, and I select the y values. I say, okay, I want the y values to actually be altitude, which is the h column. And then the x values, oh, I get an error. Okay, so let's try to work with this anyway. You can see the h values. Let me click on the x values and try to change this to the p column. All right, now I got that error, but I think it's still going to plot something because this formatting looks good. So let me hit OK. and basically it didn't listen to me. Try this again. The x values are density, which is p, and the y values are not p, they're h. So we try the h again. That time it worked, and what I get is this. Okay, so I got this plot, and this doesn't look right to me, because yeah, the y values are now the altitudes, but look at this x axis. This x-axis is not abundance. It's something different. In fact, this isn't abundance at all. What this is the data point number. So it's just counting. This is the first data point, the next one's the second, third, fourth. It's just plotting altitude as a function of data point number. So I guess this is nice. We can see the satellite track as it comes down into the atmosphere, but it's certainly not telling us anything about the abundance. So this is a little bit of a failing of Excel. Sometimes it hangs up on stuff like this. It won't do what you want it to do. And I think in this case, the reason it's not plotting what we want it to plot is because the abundance values are not, they're not sequential. So when we're trying to change the data in that way, it just hangs up because we have 700, then down to 300, then up to 1100, and back and forth and back and forth. Now this is a little bit ridiculous. The only way that I know how to fix this is to do something really kind of silly and copy this row using the commands or Control-C, Command-C on a Mac, Control-C on a Windows machine command, or simply right-clicking and copying. Pasting it over here, so I'll just click that cell and Command-V, and redoing the chart with the altitude data on the right. The way that Excel works is when you select two columns, like this, it will assume that the column on the left you want to be the X data, and the column on the right you want to be the Y data. So simply reordering the way the data shows up in our chart should make this work. This seems like a really strange hack to me, but this is how it works, and it's actually not that hard to do. So it's, as opposed to trying to figure out some other method. Sorry, let me move my chart again. We'll do chart 6. And now I actually have what I want. Down here, this is the density data. On the y-axis, it's the altitude data, so I'm happy. The naming convention for charting in general is y-axis versus x-axis. So Excel wants to call this something like altitude versus density, which is strictly true, but really we're showing density versus altitude. So let me change this plot title by triple clicking. This is going to be Argon density versus altitude. We've just rotated things around a bit. And now let me add my titles. Axis title vertical is going to be altitude. The units are kilometers. That is very small, so I'm going to triple click and then right click to select font and make this 14. Hit OK. And then let me add a horizontal title. Triple click, make this density. Units are number of molecules per meter cubed. Again, this is tiny, so I triple click on font, and make this 14. All right, so I've got something approaching what I want. I'm a little bit picky, so what I want to do is I want to select that 3, and I'm going to try to make that, I'm going to right click and do font, and I want to make that superscript. That just looks so much nicer. I mean, it's still really hard to read, but if this were zoomed in a little bit, I might be able to see that better. So zoomed in, you can see that I made that 3 a superscript. Okay, just to me it looks a little bit nicer. It looks a little bit more professional, which is what we're after. Okay, so now on this plot you really can see that we have individual data points, not a solid line. All right, so I don't like how these individual data points look like. I don't like what are these squares on their side or diamonds? And so I'm going to change those. I'm going to change those by just clicking on the data and so that selects the actual data instead of the chart. And if we go over here to the paint bucket and click on marker, you can see this first one is marker options. And I'm going to choose built-in and change the type here. It's, usually just a circle is good enough, and I can change the size of the circle to whatever I want. So I think that looks pretty nice if you want to use the actual data points themselves. Okay. Notice here that there's 2 lines. There's actually data coming down and then data coming back out. Think about the spacecraft as it's in orbit around the planet Mars. At some point it comes down into the atmosphere, and then it hits a minimum altitude, which is right around 150 kilometers, like we said, and then it goes back out of the atmosphere. And so we get these 2 passes. One is inbound and one is outbound as it's traveling across the planet. Okay, so this plot looks pretty nice at this point. You could format it in a lot of different ways. The last thing that I want to mention is going back to our original discussion on look at the data here. We go from what is this 3 times 10 to the looks like 8th all the way down to pretty close to 0. And so this is the type of plot that might be screaming out to be formatted using a log axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the axis. You can see we get the format axis box, and over here there are different options now because I'm actually on the axis, and over here on the right is this axis options box. If I click on that, I have a variety of options that we've seen before, and I just want to click on logarithmic scale. Right? This puts all my density data on a logarithmic scale so that I can see a little bit more detail here down at the higher altitudes. When it does this, it tries to format the scale appropriately. I don't like that we get all this white space, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit by making the the minimum bound 100. And so I get a little bit better idea of, I can see this data a little bit better. And now we can really start to pull out some things. We're seeing that there's this linear trend when plotted on a logarithmic scale. In other words, this data is certainly logarithmic. And we're seeing more variability. We see more of the detail in the plot because this stuff isn't getting washed out but because it's so close to 0 compared to this data up here. So this is a good data set to use a logarithmic plot on because the data spans so many different orders of magnitude. Okay, just like before, I can also do the same thing. I can zoom in. I'm gonna get a lot of white space down here, so I can also zoom in on the y-axis. So when I click on the y-axis, you see my format axis options update, so that I'm now messing around with the y-axis. I'm going to change the minimum to 100. That's pretty good. I can even maybe zoom in a little bit more to 150. And the 350 up at the top seems good. And now I'm getting even more detail. You can see that my data is really in a pretty nice line lower in the atmosphere, but up at the top there's a lot of spread in the data. And that could be due to uncertainty in the data and the measurements themselves, or just because the atmosphere is so thin up here, I get a lot of variability, intrinsic variability in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about today. Next week we'll come back and we'll do a little bit more with plotting in Excel, but this should get you started. Remember, most of the time we're going to want to use, whenever we're doing charts, we're going to want to go and find this scatter chart. Now in this case, I could have certainly gone and done, I could have done a scatter with straight lines, maybe without markers, just the lines themselves. It depends on the data that you want to visualize. That might have been appropriate for what I've done here. Scatter, either one of these would work. I usually would have advocate staying away from smooth lines because you're kind of insinuating something about the data when you put this line in there. Remember, we only have data where these individual points are. And so when you add a line, you're kind of being a little bit, not dishonest, but you're being a little bit sneaky because you don't have data at all those points on the line. And so if you start to smooth out the line, well, now you're kind of telling the person that's visualizing this data that, hey, look at how nice and smooth my data is, when that may not be the case. Just take a look at this plot. If I added a nice smooth line through here, there might be some misrepresentation about what's happening up here. The data is not smooth, it's very noisy, and so I want to try to avoid stuff like that in general. Right? So usually a good first step or a good guess is first guess is to use a scatter plot because that'll be the most honest way to present your data.